All right, welcome to everybody today. You'll notice on my screen it says Lisa Combs, OACB. I know lots of you that way, but I think a lot of you also know that I am the proud parent of a person with Prader-Willi Syndrome, and I have been serving on the board of Prader-Willi Syndrome Association of Ohio for quite a while. And I'm super excited to have Steve Fetsko here. He is our fearless leader on the PWSA Board of Ohio. He's been doing it for quite a while. I don't want to date him, so but he's been the president. I don't know. How long have you been president,
Well,
Steve?
this is my second term. I think this
Yeah.
term's been 10 years.
I was gonna say,
I had to get
yeah.
off for a little while to get my other kids graduated from high school.
Well, Steve has been really great for the board and done all kinds of things and kept us moving. We obviously are a very small board with just a few members and but we try to keep up with what's going on. And Steve has a wonderful son who likes me more than he likes Steve or his mother.
Absolutely.
And and my son likes Steve more than he likes me. So anyway, Steve, I'm gonna give it to you. And
Thank
thanks so
you.
much for being here today.
So, as Lisa said, I'm Steve Fetsko. I'm president of PWSA of Ohio, and I do have a son that is 25 now, and you'll see some of his pictures in the presentation today. And I'm a fairly comfortable presenter and casual. So Lisa will be watching the chat. And if you have questions, she'll probably pipe in and answer them at that point. I think that
Sorry if
would
I
be,
messed you up when I changed your view. I hope you're good. Get
no,
situated.
I'm still good.
Okay.
I was just getting set up. So everybody should be able to see the headline screen right now.
Yep, we're
So
good.
So today we're going to go through a lot of slides that we've put together over the course of the last 10 years. We're going to skip over a couple slides and highlight a few things in here. But I wanted to give you all the slides that we typically have so that you can review it at your leisure. If there's other questions that you have that come up, hopefully I answer them in the slides, even if I don't answer them in the presentation. So we've broken it up into 7 sections: general description of Prader-Willi, the genetics, and then the stages. I kind of look at that as one grouping, and then physical and behavioral characteristics are broken up, but I look at that as a different section. And then there's a lot of health risks to Prader-Willi syndrome that most people are not aware of at all. So we go through and highlight those. And then things to consider, things that I'll highlight again from the presentation, and also get into some of the things that we should be thinking about as we're trying to help our people. Um, Again, something for me, I'm 25, my son's 25. I've been on the board most of those years and many of those as president. But my regular job is as an engineer at a stamping company. So as Lisa said, we've got a few volunteers here. So my general day-to-day communication is not about DODD and staffing and HPC and everything else. So some of my verbiage might not be the proper lingo. I hope you can um, uh, look past that
We'll be
because
forgiving, Steve. We'll be
yes,
forgiving. No
thank you.
worries.
Okay, so general description, even 25 years ago, it would say Prader-Willi is a genetically based developmentally disability characterized by insatiable appetite, behavior problems, poor growth, and learning disabilities. And 25 years ago, when my son was born, BCMH would not cover our son because Prader-Willi was a behavioral syndrome and they were only dealing with medical issues. So my wife got our son to be the first person to be approved for Prader-Willi syndrome under BCMH, showing how many medical issues there are with kids. Now, my son was diagnosed when he was 6 weeks old, so we knew fairly early, and they weren't used to seeing kids diagnosed that early. So there's a reason why this was not common at that time. But certainly there's a lot of medical issues involved with Prader-Willi syndrome. So genetically, the genetics start in the 15th chromosome. It's from the father's side, and the expectation is somewhere between 1 in 12,000 and 1 in 15,000 births. There's no known cause. And interestingly, if the same disability or change is in the mother's chromosome, it would now be Angelman syndrome. And if anybody is aware of both syndromes, they're significantly different, even though they're coming from the same regions. Now, Prader-Willi is coming from three main different defects. You could have a long deletion, a short deletion, or UPD, and I'll go through that in a minute. And I think this is critical because when you look at the symptoms of those with Prader-Willi syndrome, there is a very wide variation in the syndromes, in the symptoms. So as we talk about being ISP individualizing everything for people, I think it's really important for Prader-Willi syndrome to keep in mind that the syndrome's symptoms are so varying that you can't assume that what works for one child will also work for another child and vice versa. Lisa and I have significantly different histories in raising our kids, and we both believe that we raised our kids appropriately for that kid, and it wouldn't have worked for the other two.
Yeah.
So I've got this slide here that's showing the genetics of a normal chromosome. And in here, the black would represent active genes that are always active. Uh, White ones are inactive. And then you have some areas of the chromosomes that are parentally controlled. So red would represent mother-controlled genes, and blue would represent father-controlled genes. So for the most part, we're looking at a segment of the 15th chromosome on the father's section that is removed. There's natural breakpoints in the genes, and this happens to be one of the natural breakpoints, and it gets lost during conception. So you can see they're missing some of this. There's also a long deletion that misses a larger portion. UPD is getting 2 chromosomes from the mother, 15s, and none from the father. So what that does is now this gene is supposed to be turned on, and it's not. And the other part of it is now instead of having one gene turned on, now you have 2. So I happen to be one of the rare fathers that gets to say that my child's biggest problems is he got too much of my wife and not enough of me. And I say that as a joke, but it also hits the point, I think, right? Because we all know that too much of a good thing can be bad for us. Too much sugar, too much protein, too much anything is not a good thing. So we don't really know what happens to this extra little segment that's added in there, and we have too much of it. And I think this is where the variation in the symptoms comes into play. So back to the demographics. So when we're looking at 1 in 12 to 1 in 15,000, uh, we're looking at about 22 to 27 million people in the United States with Prader-Willi syndrome. This is based on the census from 2020. And in Ohio, we should have somewhere between 800 and 1,000. Now, a lot of them are still unaccounted for. There's a lot of early genetic testing done now that's capturing a lot of them in the younger age. But if a child passes the APGE scores at birth, and a lot of our kids do very well in the beginning of the APGE score, and the symptoms don't show up for, a couple hours afterwards, then they could just be overlooked. And I think there's a lot of people that are borderline that are in the general population that don't know they have Prader-Willi syndrome. And when we described this syndrome to my aunt, she explained that her neighbor came over one time, and her husband went into the kitchen, got out a plate of cookies, put them down. They went back to go get the milk. They came back a little bit later, and the cookies were gone, and she was all stressed out, and she left. This is a very clear example of Prader-Willi-like behavior. So she might have Prader-Willi and doesn't even know it. Um, so when we look at that 1 in 12 and 1 in 15, how does it affect the counties? So this is a representation of the expected number of people in your county that would have Prader-Willi syndrome based on 1 in 12,000. So if you look at all the red highlighted ones, that's 5 or less in your county. And so over half the counties in 2020 would have a 5 or less estimated population. And why I highlight this is because as our kids get older and they want to go out on their own and find a roommate, find ways to live out in the community, you have to help them find a suitable roommate. And for Prader-Willi syndrome, we believe that the best solution is if they're in a home with all people with Prader-Willi syndrome or appetite control, food control environment. Now, again, as I said, that's not perfect for everybody, but we think it should be the common thought process to begin with. So if we take Henry County, for example, and they only are supposed to have 2 people, they can't take a 50-year-old woman and a 2-year-old boy and put them together in the same group home. That's not practical. So it's really hard to find good housing community links. And that's why we only have, right now, I think we only have 6 houses in Ohio that are Prader-Willi only homes, and the rest of our population is scattered. So part of it is right here, where it's really hard to find local people to live with. All right. So Prader-Willi is in 2 main syndromes, stages. So the families, you may not see these families until they're teenagers or older and they're already into stage 2. But I think it's important to understand what the families had to go through when their child was born. So stage 1, in many cases, the child's going to be a floppy baby, unable to eat properly. So they may have had a G tube, they may have a nose tube. They're going to be sleeping more than a normal kid. They're not going to meet the milestones. Um, and so this is a very stressful time for parents. And this was my son at 1 week old. He was in the NICU for 6 weeks and couldn't even open his eyes for the first week. So we didn't know what was going on at the time and extremely stressful for us. But once we got the diagnosis of Prader-Willi syndrome, at least we knew what to start going after. Growth hormone was brand new at the time. We needed physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational. So anything you can do to give guidance to the parents is going to be very helpful. And again, you may not meet these parents until their child is much older, but like I said, I think it's helpful to understand that the families have been dealing with this for day one, and there's many complications that go on early. So then the parents are worried about stage 2. So first of all, we're trying to get more calories, more calories, more calories into our kids so they can grow strong enough to start walking and meeting the milestones. And then all of a sudden, somewhere in the age 2 or older, it switches over to the point where it seems like their brain finally realizes what this meaning of the feeling in their stomach is. Oh, they're hungry. I think they don't really realize what that feeling is for a long time because a normal baby feels full, feels hungry, feels full, feels hungry. They get used to learning it. But in our kids, they feel hungry, 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 hungry. And it takes them several years to figure out what that means. And all of a sudden they figure it out. And now you start getting into weight control problems, increased behavior problems. And then the learning disabilities will start showing up along with more speech language problems and social isolation. So all of this starts in the brain, and there's 2 main sections in the brain that are affected right off the bat as part of the development in the early ages. And the main one you'll hear is the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is not working properly. It does work somewhat, but it doesn't react to the normal signals that you would normally get. And the hypothalamus controls many of the hormonal systems, including the pituitary gland, which we all hear about as we go through biology class in high school. Well, that is going to control our growth hormone. It's going to control reproductive hormones, appetite, metabolism, and body temperature. The other thing that the brain seems to be very good at remembering a lot of detailed long-term memory information, but has a hard time uh, processing and understanding short-term memory. So, and a lot of this has to do with their focus. And as anybody knows, a 2-year-old is going to be focused on what he wants to be focused on. And if he's watching TV and you try to talk to him, they're not going to hear very well what you want them to hear. So a lot of our kids, I think, exhibit this same symptom for a longer period of time where they are very focused on certain things. We don't necessarily know what they're focused on. So when we talk to them, they're not ready to listen yet. And you have to make sure they're ready to listen. I think that's the root of the poor short-term memory. But I can tell you that my son can probably tell us what we ate at the zoo 10 years ago, and I would have no clue, right? So I've got this chart trying to show the connection between the hypothalamus and the symptoms. So the hypothalamus main regulations are growth hormone, satiety, which is the appetite control, homeostasis, which is body temperature control, sexual development, sleep, and stress. And certainly, if you look up Prader-Willi syndrome main symptoms, you're going to find growth deficient, excessive eating, inconsistent control of body temperature, incomplete sexual development, poor sleep, daytime sleepiness, sleepiness and sleep apnea, and a lot of anxiety. And of course, these all connect very, very nicely. And this is one of the early confirmations from the medical community that the hypothalamus was the dominant factor in Prader-Willi syndrome. But more recently, they've learned that the frontal lobe of the brain is also underdeveloped. So here we're looking at reasoning, impulse control, problem solving, and social, sexual, behavioral development problems. And we see all of these in the kids with Prader-Willi syndrome also over time. So the IQ is diminished. And so we're looking at typically 55 to 70 on the studies. But keep in mind that 5% of them will have an average IQ. But the problem is they will test on an IQ test higher than they're going to function. So a lot of the other anxiety and other issues are going to get in the way of the way they're going to function in society. Okay, so some of the physical characteristics. Hypotonia, you see that at birth very easily, very low muscle tone. Growth hormone helps somewhat, but not completely. But this is also going to reduce the nutritional needs. So without controls, without excessive exercise or growth hormone, a typical person would only have 800 to 1,000 calories a day. And that's what we get when we go and get our Big Mac at McDonald's. So not used to thinking in those levels. So it's really hard to control the weight in a normal setting without controlling all food access. Incomplete sexual development, we talked about. Hormone replacement can help a little bit. Doesn't complete it though, typically. Developmental delays, you're looking at 1 to 3 years in physical delays. My son couldn't walk until he was between 5 and 6. So speech and language difficulties, even as they get older, the mouth is misshapen a little bit. Higher palate makes it hard for them to make some sounds. And so speech and language is difficult. And there's also could be neurological issues that hinder. My son, when he was young, learned my name as Yaya, and I was Yaya for 1.5 years until he relearned my name was Dad. And so who knows how he got that. But once it was in there, it was in there. Skeletal problems. Part of this is the lack of muscle tone. So the bones don't get the pressure on them like they normally do. They're not jumping and bouncing around all the time like normal kids. So it doesn't put pressure on the bone, and the bone becomes porous And they can develop osteoporosis very young. Um, and it's both men and women. And these same symptoms also create a lot more scoliosis in our kids. Short stature, again, growth hormone deficiency would create that. Mild dysmorphology. In the past, before growth hormone, this is how most doctors would help diagnose Prader-Willi syndrome. It would be the overweight, and then they would look, oh, there's small hands and feet, almond-shaped eyes, and turned down mouth. Okay, and they would clinically diagnose Prader-Willi syndrome before all the genetic testing.
Steve, while you're on that one, can we go back really
Yes,
quick?
sure.
A note I made when you were talking earlier, I think it's really important for SSAs to keep in mind that you're going to see very different outwardly looking and acting, even potentially people that are maybe in their older 20s and then older than that. So, or anybody younger than maybe 24, 25, because with the development of growth hormone therapy and more advancements in special diet, what I have seen, and I'm not a researcher, but is that the younger folks are taller, they're often thinner, not always, but sometimes thinner if they're being managed well. And they actually often have less intellectual disabilities, I believe. And the diet, they're getting lots more. When my son was young, and I'm sure Steve, we were all about
Yeah,
calories. We were not
right.
about, about healthy fats and stuff. It was just like right away, we knew our child had this. We need to stick to a calorie diet. So when brains were developing, there was a fat, like healthy fat even was not part of my son's diet. Nowadays they know that like we still need healthy fat, and so they've come up with lots of wells. So you're going to see the younger crowd is going to be taller, maybe thinner, maybe less intellectual disability, still could have some of those other things still. And then
Yeah.
the older group is definitely going to be more likely short statured, maybe more intellectual disabilities potentially, and then over more the weight. But I mean the weight eventually comes on almost everybody, by the way, so
Yeah.
in a different way, that's all.
But you're right. That's one of the skills that we have to learn over time is how do you give somebody 1,200 calories a day and get all the protein and all the nutrition that they need? It's not just calories. So some of the things that people aren't aware with Prader-Willi syndrome is this perseverative thinking. Um, they can get stuck on an object or a topic or even a person. My son tends to get stuck on people more than topics. Um, so some of the strategies would be, and for me, the best one, if you can do it, is using them to write down the answer to the question. So as one of the people would say, when are we going to church? When are we going to church? And no matter how many times you answer that, they will still have that question in the head. And so having them write it down usually gets past that issue, but it can be very tricky for people that are not familiar with this. Rigid thought process. Again, most of them are going to have a need for routine and consistency, partially because they're not familiar with their surroundings and how to interpret what's going on around them. So they get anxious, and this turns into a need for that consistency. Certainly, you never want to promise something you can't keep. And if you're going to change anything in the schedule, you have to give them enough time to adjust. So normally you take a 5-year-old and you say, okay, it's recess time. They just get up and they go out and do recess instantly. But if our kids are sitting there trying to finish a task, you're going to have to give them a little bit of time, even though it's something they're excited to go do, that's probably going to create some problems, and you're going to need to give them a little bit of time. So autism spectrum. My son is diagnosed with autism spectrum also. And I think there's a lot of autism spectrum in Prader-Willi syndrome um, symptoms. So when you look at autism spectrum, you've got poor social skills, rigid thought processing, focused interest, and poor emotional control. And certainly, most of the people with Prader-Willi syndrome I've met have some amount of these four items. I don't think it's true classical autism. Um, Most of our kids want to be social. They just don't know how to be social. They want to give, and most of them are very good huggers. They love to give hugs. They like that deep pressure of a hug. And and so it's not what you would normally think of an autism. So I want to make that clear that there are people with Prader-Willi syndrome that also have autism, but Prader-Willi in itself does not make them autistic, but there are symptoms in there that you can use as strategies to help you take care of them. And so that's why I pointed out that way. Um, so what we have is my son Jason likes rules, and that comes back to the rigid thought process and the not understanding the surroundings around him. So we're able to use the rules and help him control behavior. So he gets certain foods at certain times, and other people get foods at different times, and that's okay for him because that's how the rules are. Um, so he was also very sensory tactile problems when he was young. So we had to do all the brushing therapy in the during the day when he was an infant, and he still has sensory problems. Now, his emotional control sometimes affects how his sensory is going. So be aware that some of these kids may have very large sensory problems, both audio and tactile. So difficulty with peer socialization, we talked about that. Tenuous emotional control. So they tend to have big swings in their emotions. And I think it's very important to define a safety zone ahead of time. And where do they go when they have a problem? Um, they will typically follow that at that time, but not always. Sometimes this will turn into oppositional defiance as part of the emotional control. I don't generally see this as a regular day-to-day issue, but when the emotions get out of control, this turns into oppositional defiance in many cases. And remember that fairness will be in their eyes, not yours. But the key is to speak softly and calmly. Never try to argue with them at that time. I had to learn these lessons many times. Um, Sometimes it's saying this is the rule and try to deflect it from you. So again, using the autism rule to your benefit and not saying that you are the reason why he can't do what he wants to do. Sorry, jumped ahead. And make sure they're comfortable with police coming in, because if they're already in an agitated state and there's problems going on where they're being defiant and a policeman walks in, they're going to put up that extra defense, and now the police will have to manually take care of them instead of calmly taking care of them. Poor stamina, that comes from the muscle tone. Keep in mind they may need to take a rest time. Elopement. So elopement could be both food-based and just general elopement. Um, when it's food-based, it's going to be much longer and it's going to be much harder to control long-term. Alarms may be needed on the doors and windows, sometimes in severe cases, maybe even locks. So excessive eating, I look at it as a behavior and a physical characterization. So now we're looking at how that reacts. Now they're going to potentially get out and go in the trash and get food. They may go to the neighbor's house and steal food. They may run away to get food. Eating too fast and shoving the food in their mouth is one that we all have to work on. Um, and so one of the other problems is they can be easily coerced into inappropriate behaviors. Um, you know, Teenagers may get them to do inappropriate things at schools. There could even be trading sexual favors for food. And this is not a single occurrence topic that has been noted many times. So we got to be careful that the food doesn't become a new behavior problem that creates things we don't want to have happening. So part of the strategies would be certainly counting all calories everywhere, trying to make sure that the food is not visible and not available, and certainly control the money. So from a shoving point of view, I just put in here because in 2018, it was noted by the director that the choking is the issue in the DD population in general. Now imagine somebody who feels like they have never eaten in their life, and they're going to grab that food and eat it as fast as they can. We had somebody in Ohio 12 years ago pass away in a hospital choking because they had uh, choked on their food. And this is a hospital setting that should have been taking care of them better. But our kids are not looked at as a choking hazard by the medical community um, as much as they probably should be. So here's some of the other special health risks that are in Prader-Willi syndrome that nobody talks about. Excessive appetite, we talked about it, but I want to point out one last thing, that they cannot control their food intake, and you shouldn't expect them to. If you put a 5-ounce steak in front of them, they will eat a 5-ounce steak. If you put a 20-ounce steak in front of them, they'll eat a 20-ounce steak. If you put a 40-ounce steak, it just, they will eat everything that you give them. It may take them a little longer, but that's the nature of the syndrome. So hospitals are a big issue because typically they have standard weights of measure on their food plates. So when Jason goes into the hospital, we always tell him to cut it in half and put that on the plate. Same thing we do at a restaurant is we get a take-home box and cut it in half and put the other half in the take-home box. So here is a lady that was at 85 pounds already by the time she was 4 years old. And regrettably, she passed away when she was 21 years old. Now, this was a long, long time ago. And there's a lot of new information that comes out. But I think this is the key right here is people have to remember that one cookie a day. So if she was getting one cookie extra per day from somebody at school or even from the parents, that's 150 calories. And you're looking at almost 16 pounds per year for one cookie a day. So by the time she got out of school, she may have gained 187 of those pounds just because somebody's trying to be nice to her and give her one extra cookie a day. Here's another lady who was a 20-year-old and then found a group home that gave her much better environmental controls. And by time 7 years later, she's the lady on the left and she's, back to normal. And so environment is critical. Pain threshold is something else that nobody talks about, but they have a very deep pain or high pain threshold. So they don't feel deep pain like we do. Many occasions they will break a bone and not tell you. My son broke his ankle, and EMTs were worried about the bump on his head, and all he said was, my ankle hurts a little bit too. So they X-rayed his ankle, and it was broken. He was walking on it, got into the cart, and everything didn't seem to bother him, other than he said, "Oh, it's hurting a little bit." So anytime they have any medical issues, so it's not just broken bones, but ulcers, appendicitis, ear infections, you're not going to get the true representation from them telling you that it hurts. They also should not get narcotics typically because they have adverse reaction to medications because their metabolism is so low compared to typical. So skin picking, again, is a big one. And when you add this into what I said about the uh, deep pain, high pain threshold, that they will pick down to the bone. And I've actually seen this, regrettably. And the EMTs were asking, well, where's the knife or where's the tool? And no, it was just the fingers picking at the sore and going down. And they confirmed that it was the fingernails that were doing it. So these sores could last for years because it's really hard to keep them from picking at it once they start. People have tried keeping their hands busy with bubble wrap and squeeze balls, and that helps a little bit. But covering up these wounds with a bandage, you may look at it as a severe issue, but we've had a parent that reverted back to duct tape on the arm in order to keep his son from getting through the bandage. So he would put the bandage and then the duct tape around it. And that's the only thing that allowed it to heal at all. So strange things happen sometimes. Respiratory concerns, sleep apnea can be common, and they should have sleep studies done on a regular basis because it can be obstructive sleep apnea or brain-based, and they could come on anytime. So just because they're at a normal, typical weight does not mean they don't have sleep apnea. Body temperature controls. When my son was young, we had to keep our house below 60 or he would get a red face and a heat rash. Now, as he got older, his body typical temperature is getting higher. We could keep the house at a normal temperature, but most of them won't have a normal body temperature. Most of them are going to be below normal. So the way I understand this is medically, the body is reacting to their expectation that they have not eaten. So now the body's starting to shut down. It has the low metabolism, so it has less energy being created, but it's also shutting down parts of the body to keep survival mode going. So the body temperature is typically a little bit lower. Now, that doesn't mean that a person with a 94 temperature is doing okay, or that a person with 100 temperature is doing okay. So it can go up or down in 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 instances, but typically their body temperature will be lower. We have had cases where Jason's temperature will just go up to 100 for some reason. We'll never find out. Um, but the one you guys have to worry about is you may have somebody with appendicitis that shows or an infection that shows no temperature. And so when we go to the ER, we have to explain that yes, you're going to take his temperature, but when you see a 99 temperature, that's actually 4 degrees higher than his temperature was on a normal basis. And if we go 4 degrees higher, we have 102.6. Well, they would react to that very quickly, but they don't react to 99 very quickly. So we have to make sure that we tell them what that base temperature is. Osteoporosis, we talked about, it can come on early, scoliosis and kyphosis. Vomiting. So most of the Prader-Willis, a study found out that about 2/3 do not ever vomit. So if they ever throw up, you're typically dealing with a severe problem. Jason was allergic to certain foods and his intestines were getting irritated. He started vomiting at night and we took him in, and that's how we found out that he was allergic and his stomach was inflamed. Not because his temperature was high, not because he was telling us he had any pain. A normal person would have been in such severe pain, they would have told us long before this happened. They do have a lot of dental problems. They have a thick saliva typically, and soft enamel. Gastroparesis is something that has been a topic in the last 5 years. There was a mortality study done 5 years ago, and they found out that a lot of the causes of death were misdiagnosed, or they should have been co-diagnosed. That the intestine system is just not processing food effectively. It's a very slow processing. So the stomach will empty slower. The colons will empty slower. Most of our kids will have constipation problems. Most of them will be on Miralax or some form of laxative to keep their system working properly. So as that food's in the stomach longer, it can create these hard collections of food and can rupture the stomach. And again, if you're not feeling the pain, then this ruptured stomach can become severe even before they get to the hospital. So I've got two classifications, but they're similar to each other. but you could have gastric illnesses from binge eating also, and going out and eating too much and rupturing the stomach without any of the other problems happening. So that's why I've got them broken in two different sections. Complications of obesity are pretty typically known, so I'll jump over that one. So this is what Lisa was alluding to, is 30 years ago, most Prader-Willis were diagnosed in their mid-teens because there weren't medical tests to confirm it. Now, most of them are being diagnosed as infants. So environmental controls will equal weight management. And this is my son when he was 16, and weight management doesn't equal cure. And as Lisa was saying, you're going to see a lot of kids looking like this coming to you in their mid-teens, and we hope to try and keep them that way. But the natural response is, well, it's okay if he has another cookie a day, or it's okay, he really doesn't have Prader-Willi. The parents just are thinking this is, and it's not real because he doesn't look like Prader-Willi. Growth hormone will fix a lot of the dysmorphology, and when you control the weight, the other aspects of Prader-Willi aren't so obvious. So families have to start from day one on this balancing act. And as they get older and they need more help and you're there to assist it, we're looking at, do we put locks on the refrigerator and the cabinets or no locks? Are all calories the same? Do we try and use a strict diet? As Lisa was alluding to, some parents are giving zero sugar to their kids for their entire life. And they expect you to follow through with that as they get into adulthood and go into a group home. And that's not going to be an easy transition for any group home to deal with. Special education or inclusion, or do you put them into private school? Guardianship versus supported decision making. And I think this summers up, do we adjust the environment to fit the individual versus can we help them to adapt to the world? And again, my son Jason, we adjusted the environment to fit Jason, and Lisa tended to go more towards helping her son to adapt to the world. But each family is going to be different.
Steve, we should have put a picture of him and see how that's going.
John Ross, yeah. Well, Lisa's son has some weight problems going on right now, and that's one of the risks, and that's a big part of the balancing act. My son's 140 right now.
400.
Yeah. So recently we've been working with the state on the adjustments to the rules. And so this is the summary of the prohibited measures. I want to highlight this one here where it talks about denying someone breakfast, lunch, and snack. So we were able to get the state to acknowledge that before this, let me back up a second. Before this, it was always the unwritten rule. This applies to, oh, this is Prader-Willi syndrome. Oh, that doesn't really apply. We know we have to control food for them. But the unwritten rule created problems as we were trying to write these things down on paper and get the ISP written to appropriately represent what's happening. So we had several meetings with the state before these, and we came up with a resolution that I think fits the situation very nicely. So they've acknowledged that food control is a real issue for Prader-Willi syndrome, and that it's likely that there's going to have to be something discussed about this. So as an SSA, we're hoping that instead of saying you can never control food or you can never do this, you should try to ask, how is the family controlling food? Because I can almost guarantee that 100% of families are controlling food somehow. Some are able to get away with just the rules like I do. And Jason's rule is he needs a safety person to go in there. And he's only broken that rule a couple times. Others have to lock. And then help establish the appropriate measures are added to the ISP so that as more staff members start working with our kids, that everybody's on the same page. And certainly help understand the HRC committee understand why these restrictions would be there if they're appropriate and why they may be appropriate, because that's one of the hurdles that all of us deal with is trying to get everybody to understand in 10 minutes or less why Prader-Willi syndrome needs to have a lock on the refrigerator or this restriction or that restriction. It doesn't mean that they can't do things regarding food. Um, I take my son out to the grocery store and we go shopping, but I have to go through shopping on a list that has 10 items. We leave there with 10 items. We don't go walking around the grocery store and shop like I would normally do. So as you get into other things to consider, compatibility of residential, you may be looking at physical activity levels, calories per day. So if one person's getting 2,000 calories and somebody else is getting 800, that's going to become a long-term challenge, potentially. Um, Blocking the food. So there's also a recent discussion going on about injections because most of the people going into group homes now will be on growth hormone, and the nurse the rule is that if they're not certified to give their own shot, that a nurse may have to come daily to give a shot. So one thing that most group homes want to get close to shopping, close to the stores, being able to walk to places so they can be in the community more. But if if I have Prader-Willi syndrome and I'm sitting across the street from a Texas Roadhouse steak and I'm looking and seeing and smelling all the food, that's going to be a problem for me. And again, supervision during interaction with the public, because exploitation becomes very prevalent in this population when it's uncontrolled. Work settings, first thing I see when I walk into any room now is where are the vending machines? And then you've got condiments, you've got coworkers, you've got trash cans. You know, there's many stories about kids just grabbing 20 ketchup packages and just opening them up and eating all the ketchup in the corner. Oh, sorry. Forgot about this one. Perseveration. So again, I think the connection with people is important, but not letting it become an obsession. And because my son would want to walk around with the same person and do that person's job with them all the time and not do his job. Integration in the community. Again, we all want our kids to get out into the community, but if we consider a lot of our normal interactions in the community, there's food related to it. We go to the movies and everybody gets popcorn. Well, if our diet isn't allowing that popcorn and the calories that go along with that popcorn, then they're going to feel out of touch with everybody else. When they go to a social, if there's snacks or a snack table, they're going to hang around the snack table until somebody's not looking. At bowling, there's food everywhere, baseball games. So you can't get away from doing things in the community without food being part of it. So it should be looked at as a conflict and try to plan around it, not to avoid it completely, but understand what your client's capable of doing. We had one camper come to our Prader-Willi camp that at 2:30 he was supposed to get a snack. And at 2:30 they were over getting ready to get into the canoe to go canoeing, and he realized it was 2:30. He ran away from the group, ran to try and find me even though he didn't know where I was because I had his snack. He stopped interacting with the community and the other people and socializing because food was that important to him. So controlling the food actually helps them interact with the community and their peers better. So again, success is going to be defining the rules and the expectations ahead of time. My son, when we go out, we already know what we're getting at the store and what we're going to get at the snack bar at the bowling alley or wherever we're going. Keep in mind that the best placement, as we talked about, might be across county lines. You might not find another 52-year-old male that needs a roommate that is compatible in your own in your own county. Here's some helpful videos. This one from ZAFGen is about 10 years old, but I think it's very, very relevant still. And Max Hungry, Hungry, Hungry. I think these two videos give a little perception of what a daily living problem Prader-Willi can be. And then there's a couple links for the PWSA USA, this medical alert booklet. This is the purchase location. And I think every house that has somebody with Prader-Willi syndrome should have a medical alert booklet available for emergencies going into the ICU. So there's some resources here. Again, not to be considered as totally complete. These are residential providers that focus on Prader-Willi syndrome. But again, as I said, there's only 6 houses and most of them are spread out. I think it would be best if we find more staff that's able to handle these locations.
Hey, well, we're on that, Steve. For the
Yes,
people
ma'am.
that are on the call right now and are currently serving people with Prader-Willi syndrome, if you know their provider, I would love for you to just put it about your county and the name of the provider that is supporting them, even
That'd be
if it's
great.
because we're trying to reach out to more providers to develop more resources, but it's hard to
Yes.
figure that out.
And we're happy to do this presentation to any provider that has somebody with Prader-Willi syndrome any day. So what we
Nice.
also try to do is get some socialization between those with that have Prader-Willi syndrome. When we first started our events, I remember Pittsburgh Institute was still active and everybody would come to the event and they'd say, "Oh, so and so, I haven't seen you since Pittsburgh." And now they come to camp and they say, "I haven't seen you since last year's camp." So I puts a huge smile on my face. Pittsburgh closed down, but there's still a need. There is a place in Houston, Nexus, that is trying to fulfill some of that. When our people get so overweight that they're in severe medical crisis, Pittsburgh used to be the place where they would go and lose weight and then go back to that residential facility and hopefully with different environmental controls. Nexus is the only place in the country now. So we also do a snowflake ball where we do red carpet and highlight their achievements for the year. And this is just a slide of many different people with Prader-Willi syndrome that come to camps or different events. And I think it's really important to focus on the individual because they will need different support structures for everybody. And that's the last slide. And this is how you could communicate back with us. And I actually met my 45-minute
You did
time limit.
amazing. And I only interrupted a couple times. I know people are going to start signing off. So I really appreciate, I want you to notice in the chat box, I put the same thing 2 times. There is a medic alert booklet that is quite lengthy that I think is super important if you're serving somebody with Prader-Willi syndrome, that their providers or you have that. It's something because even hospital and doctors often don't understand all the medical implications. So if you can get them the link or the booklet, that would be great.
Yes.
And I tried to answer the questions in the chat box, which Kelly's going to email me separately. So that's awesome. We're getting all kinds
Okay.
of resources. And that was some of the other questions was what resources. I would say I did put in the chat box that dynamic pathways is
Yes.
also a great resource for both county boards and maybe potentially families. I'm not quite sure, but certainly county boards of DD often reach out to dynamic pathways to help specifically with behavioral strategies, getting through HRC, all those kind of things. But also PWSA of Ohio is happy to try to help. OACB, myself, I've gotten involved on some of the case specific ones, but reach out to any of us to find out how you can be helpful. What else? Let's see if I got any minute. I saw a documentary on PWS on YouTube that was good, and I suggested it to the providers who work with PWS individuals to show them how serious it is. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Amy. And if you ever want to share that with me to see if it's one I've already had. Carrie, you wanted to know if this will all be available through OACB site, correct? And I will add the medical alert to the same place also. Lots of thank you, Steve. Very informative. And maybe we'll come back and do more. There's always more to talk about. We didn't even get to talk about all the good stuff, Steve. You know,
Oh, the hugs.
awesome
I
they
put in
are.
the hugs there. The hugs are
I
the best. That's my son's official job is giving
know.
hugs.
Yes, eligibility is a big issue with Prader-Willi syndrome. I think it's really hard sometimes to realize the limitations that people with Prader-Willi syndrome have, because in many ways, many of them have a lot of great skills. But when you look at all the potential problems, if you remove that person from their home or their routine, it's super important to really give a good look at eligibility. There's very few people with Prader-Willi syndrome who aren't eligible for board services if you really learn about their disability.
And that goes back to the IQ will test higher than they're actually going to function in the real world.
Yeah, even the ones that don't have, in fact, I've seen more issues with some of the folks with higher IQs.
Yes.
But higher IQ you have, sometimes the more manipulative and ingenious you are in figuring out ways to be unsafe.
Yeah, I didn't get to tell my story about ordering the cake. There was a kid in the group home that remembered the credit card number when he went home and visited his mom, called up a bakery, said, "Send me a birthday cake. Oh, it's a surprise birthday. So go around the back. I'll lower down a rope. You tie it up." And he brought it up. And the other people in the group home said, "Hey, he's got a cake up there. He's got a cake." And the staff didn't believe. And by the time they believed, he was half done with cake. So they can be very ingenious. Just realize they're thinking about the same thing 24/7. And Albert Einstein came up with all his stuff because he thought about relativity 24/7.
Sarah just said, I used to work with someone who would have pizzas ordered to their window.
Yep.
So there you go. Yeah, Sarah, you know.
That's very common.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Willie put the another link to the CPDUs and the slides and how to get all that stuff in there. So I think we got this, and it is 4 o'clock. We did it, Willie. Not because of me, because Steve's amazing. You
Thanks,
guys
everyone.
would have been here till 5:30 if it was up to me.
Well,
Uh,
and if anybody needs another presentation for their county or right, we're happy to do this. And we've done everything between an hour and 2 hours. And when we go in person, you get that little feedback going back and forth and you get the focus topic. So
yeah, Ellen just put something in it, made me think sometimes the perseverative behavior is amazing. She said that
yeah,
she and her husband worked with a young man with PWS for 10 years, and he watched Richard Simmons videos every day and did Dancing with the Oldies. Basically, for him, it ended up being a walking program, but he stuck with it many years later. And that's awesome when you
yeah.
have folks that are willing to do that same thing just to survive. So I love that.
Luckily, he perseverated on exercise.
Yeah, I was gonna say my
It
son
could
did
have
that.
been-
My son did that for like 3 years. Now we've moved on.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and happy Thursday. I hope you have a wonderful Friday. And feel free to reach out to myself or Steve or just me, and I'll get you Steve's information anytime. Appreciate you all.